Okay, so we'll make a start. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Lee. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Harper Adams University. Great to see colleagues and friends here in the auditorium and also online. This session really is a welcome lecture for David Rose, who joined us about a month ago. We're delighted that David joined us here at Harper Adams. I first met David back in 2014, we were just saying, as part of a major DEFRA project called Sustainable Intensification Platforms. And I was extremely impressed with David's work then, and again, delighted now that he is part of the team here at Harper Adams. So a little bit of an introduction on David, which is my role today. So David is a rural geographer who holds bachelor's, master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Cambridge. Previous academic positions include as Elizabeth Creak Chair of Agricultural Innovation at both the University of Reading and at Royal Agricultural University, and recently a visiting Fulbright Professor at Cornell in the USA. The work of his Change in Agriculture group has explored how to help farming stakeholders make agricultural transitions, focusing on technology, adoption, responsible innovation, behavioural change and mental well-being. In the 9 years since defending his doctoral thesis, he has published 75 academic papers, been invited to give evidence 3 times by the UK Parliament, and contributed to major reports, including reports into DEFRA. He's an editor at the Journal of Agricultural Education and Extension, and now lead of the Sustainable Agri-food Systems Group here at Harper. David, we're very much looking forward to your lecture, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. You should never clap at the start because it might be really bad. For those who are persevering with X, do live tweet if you want to, if it still works. And I think there's plenty of people online, but I hope the external people in the room and the external people online will just forgive me for about 3 or 4 minutes while I just address my new colleagues in the room, because this is the first opportunity I've had to meet many of you. And I think as or more important than the research I'm going to do here is what I'm going to be like as a colleague. So I'm going to try in the first 2 slides to try and help you get to know me a little bit better. So 3 things here. Firstly, I have a great love for cricket. I've seen the cricket pitch outside. I've got my last piece of good form dates back to about 2011, but I'm very enthusiastic. So if anybody has links to the cricket team, I'm very happy to have a game. So this picture on the left-hand side was the last time I played cricket in 2017. This was the staff-student cricket match at Godwin and Keys College in Cambridge. I was very excited for this because I was the only person under 30, actually probably the only person under 50 on the staff team, and I was supremely confident for this, so confident that I invited my geography students to come and watch. And as we all know, I'm sure not at Harper, this doesn't happen at Harper, students can sometimes be a bit late for things, and I think these students were about 7 minutes late for this match, but 7 minutes was long enough for me to go in, go out, take my pads off, walk around the boundary edge and take this photo, so they didn't actually see me play. Secondly, I have a great love of hot chocolate. So unofficially, Holly Vickery and I did start a hot chocolate club at Harper about an hour before I had an interview 2 months ago. I think she's added Annie Williams from the Agritech Centres to the group. We haven't sorted out membership structure, but if anybody is linked to Coldy or Costa, they might need to have some more hot chocolate ordered. And lastly, bird watching. So I never turn down an external examining gig at a place that's close to a good bird reserve. And then just lastly, before I move on to the actual talk, this is very important to me. So we often see either articles or surveys of this ilk that speak about some of the challenges people face in academia. So this survey, for example, was across UK academia. And we know that the challenges of bullying, of precarity, and all sorts of different things are much less likely to affect people that look like me as a white man, and far more likely to affect other people. But there's things that senior colleagues in the room and those online can do to make sure that early career researchers particularly are better supported. So I wanted to highlight that as something that was very important to me. And to that end, I want to flag that I would have very little to talk about in this talk without the talent in the industry of the earlier career researchers who have done most of this research over a number of years. So these are the PhD students or the research assistants or postdocs that I've had the privilege of supervising over a number of years. Some I still co-supervise, many of whom have now moved on. And without their work, there wouldn't be much to talk about. And also without the support of the Elizabeth Creak Trust, who have supported me in the past, are supporting this position now, and a great number of external collaborators who aren't pictured, there wouldn't be much to talk about. So I'm going to showcase much of their work today, and I'm very privileged to have my name associated with it. So I'm going to kick off now. So the external people, thank you for indulging me for a few minutes. So today I'm going to talk about change in agriculture. I'm not going to do the bit about why we need to change, why agriculture needs to become more sustainable. I think we'll take that as a given. Everyone in the room, I think, has got that. I'm going to more talk about what change looks like, what change means, and how to encourage change. I'm going to talk about 5 different themes. So firstly, what change in agri-food systems means. Secondly, what just or fair change looks like. Thirdly, about adaptive capacity and how that influences change. Then how to encourage and incentivize change. And lastly, how to cope with change. Now, there are 2 really important aspects of change in agriculture that I'm not going to talk about. One is, well, what changes need to be made? So what are the new practices, the new technologies that can help make agriculture more sustainable? And I'm not going to talk about the very important work that is done on building the evidence base for those technologies and practices. So how do we know that the ideas that research and industry are coming up with will actually make agriculture more sustainable? That is work that's done by other colleagues here and elsewhere, not by me, but they are obviously important aspects of change. Now, if you get very bored and you have to leave, have to go and do something else more exciting, I have written about this recently in a Farmers Weekly article, which covers a lot of what I'm going to say. So if you follow the QR code, or I think this is recorded so you can go back and have a look, you can read a lot of what I'm going to say today. Okay, part 1. So what does change in agri-food systems mean? Now, let's have a show of hands here. Who has not read this book? And you can tell me, Alex, if there's any hands online. Who's not read this, or had he read to them? Oh, 1, 2 people, 3 people. I'm very sorry, I'm going to spoil this now. Although the plot isn't, you won't be too surprised about the plot if you do go and read it, because it is basic biology. But this is an example of a very simple change. The caterpillar who has no choice but to eat and eat, weave a cocoon, and transform into a butterfly. A single species of caterpillar can only ever become one species of butterfly. Doesn't have any choice in this. There's only one way of doing it, and there's only one final end point. But it's worth pointing out here that this is a disruptive process. To get the lovely butterfly that we all like to see, the caterpillar does have to, in that form, cease to exist. Now, if you think about changes that we need to make in agri-food systems and the transitions that we need to make, it's much more complicated than that process that the caterpillar's just gone through. So firstly, on the left-hand side, we have lots of different caterpillars to start with. Lots of different ways of producing food, different farming systems, different people who produce that food. So we have lots of different starting points to begin with. We then don't have one single end point. There's not one species of butterfly. There's potentially lots of different outputs that we want. Cleaner air, cleaner water, enhanced biodiversity. Protecting the livelihoods of people, feeding the world. Not all of those things at the same time, for all things, may be synonymous with one another. Sometimes there are trade-offs between those things, and sometimes, I think it's fair to say, there isn't necessarily consensus always on what those final outputs should be. And then we don't have just one single way of making the change like the caterpillar. There are lots of different potential ways in which agri-food systems can be made more sustainable. We could go down the greater intensification route. We could embrace more agroecological regenerative principles. We could go down the very high-tech route. We could go down more low-tech. We could move away from traditional farming systems and make meat in the laboratory, or grow food underground or in vertical farming systems. So there's lots of different outputs, lots of different starting points, and lots of potential ways of making changes. And that makes agri-food transitions very complicated. It makes them normative, it makes them political, because there are some people involved in these systems that have more power to make those choices than others, and that's what I'm going to try and tease out today. The other thing I want to make clear is that change takes time. Now, you might argue we haven't got that much time if you want to reach net zero targets by 2040 or 2050 or whatever the target is. But change in agriculture does take time, and it's always taken time. So some of the work that James DeBoer's done here, for example, shows that some technologies are adopted more quickly than others in agriculture. Other bits of work, Van der Veen's paper, shows that change in agriculture is one usually of evolution rather than revolution, something that takes decades rather than something that happens overnight. And some work that we've done has looked at, well, is change in agriculture always at the adoption of something new, a new piece of technology, a new idea? And we often find that that's not the case at all, that actually some of the ideas that might help us move towards sustainable systems might actually be very old ideas. If you think of some of the regenerative agriculture principles, greater embracing of mixed farming, for example, none of those things are particularly new. But from that, I wanted to point out that change is disruptive, it takes time, it's normative and political. Now, just because change is disruptive doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. You often hear that. Some people might lose because of the change, some livelihoods might be destroyed, we're going to move away from tradition and that's bad. Just because it's disruptive doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't do it, but we should think about how we do that change. And that brings me on to just or fair change or transitions. Now, the phrase just transition, if you've come across it before, you might have been more likely to have come across it in the context of energy transitions. So the IPCC have spoken about it longer than perhaps the FAO have. So these are conversations we've had or are having around, well, we know we need to close coal mines, but how do we close coal mines in a way that doesn't mean that people who work down the coal mines lose out? If we think about many of the post-industrial areas of the UK that are very deprived, in some cases, that industry that supported people in those areas did need to close. But those places didn't need to be left behind. There were various policy instruments that could be used, welfare, reskilling, diversification, to make sure that those places didn't fall behind. And just transitions is increasingly being spoken about in agriculture. So the FAO talk about it. A piece of work that the Food and Farming and Countryside Commission are doing talks about what a just transition is. And it's very important that we have these conversations, because a just transition, and whether food producers and others involved in this system think that the changes that they are being asked to or told to make are fair or not, underpins many of the protests that we have seen in recent years. And I could have shown pictures from anywhere. This happens to be Wales, some of the European protests, some protests in India, but many of these protests come around as a result of, in this case, farmers feeling like the changes that they are being asked or told to make aren't fair. And I think a lot of the time it's how the changes are being made. Sometimes it's the outputs, the goals that people are protesting about, that net zero, for example, isn't something we should be moving towards. And I'd argue very strongly that we have to enable the inclusion and conversations to happen about the how rather than the what. If we start to dilute the goals of net zero and more sustainable agriculture, we've got a real problem. The how, though, and how we make sure we do those sustainable transitions in a fair way is something we can have much better conversations about, I think. So what is a just agricultural transition? So this is some work that a PhD student, Ulrike de Boon, led. And this framework that she came up with is largely borrowed and an amalgamation of justice concepts that have been used elsewhere. But she argued in this paper that just agricultural transitions had three real main components. So firstly, thinking about distributional justice. So what are the costs and the benefits associated with the changes that are being made, and how are they distributed in society? And secondly and thirdly, these are linked. Procedural justice, so how is society involved in making the decisions about what changes are going to happen? And in that process of deciding upon the changes that are going to be put forward, how are marginalised groups, different scales of knowledge, different knowledge types included in that? And in that latter, I will put multi-species justice in there too, not just the involvement of marginalised humans, but also non-humans as well. And there's been an awful lot of work been done in this area by our group and many groups of social scientists around the world. And some may be watching. I can't possibly do justice to the huge amount of work that has been done in many of these areas. I'm just going to pick a few. So on distributional justice, I like particularly the work of Kelly Bronson, who's at Ottawa, but there's many other scholars. She and others have looked at, well, some of the new innovations and new technologies that are being proposed as a way of achieving more sustainable agriculture. How are the benefits and the costs associated with those technologies and innovations distributed across society? We often hear about the benefits. There's an awful lot of techno-optimism associated with new agricultural technologies. You hear less about how those benefits are distributed across society and how they might be unevenly distributed, and less about what the costs associated with some of those new technologies and innovations might be. So just briefly, some examples of the work we've done in this area. So we've done some work looking at autonomous robotics, obviously a key priority of Harper Adams, leading the world very much in this area. And undoubtedly, there are many benefits associated with the use of autonomous robotics and AI in agriculture. And we can go through them, and I'm sure you've heard many talks about the benefits that that could bring to people, production, and the planet. But there are also costs associated, potential costs associated with the use of those technologies, and the potential for the benefits to be unevenly distributed. And we need to have those conversations and try and foresee what the costs might be in order to understand how we might come up with guidelines, regulations, codes of practice, etc., that might help us use autonomous robotics in a fairer, more just way. And that work I know Harper has been doing with codes of practice, looking very much at the ethics of autonomous robotics. Secondly, I'm involved in some work that's led by Tom Macmillan at the Royal Agricultural University that is looking at cultured meat. So cultured meat, again, a new innovation that has the potential to lead to more sustainable agri-food systems. If we can grow meat in a laboratory and spare some of the land from livestock production, that has the potential to make an important contribution to net zero, etc. But how are the potential benefits of cultured meat distributed across society? And what are some of the potential costs of that new innovation? This project is particularly interested in how cultured meat will affect livestock farmers in the UK. What do they think about it? What might be the opportunities for existing farmers to be involved in this new space of cultured meat? But what are some of the potential downsides? Maybe loss of reduction of livestock, loss of identity, loss of community, maybe a perception that came out in this paper that cultured meat is, and the companies involved in cultured meat are maybe lacking in transparency, and etc., etc. So there's a conversation to be had about the cost, not just the benefits. And then lastly, this was some work that Julia Shinnings did, she finished last year as a PhD student at Reading, on precision livestock technologies. Again, that is a key focus of Harper Adams, some of the work that Mark Rutter and lots of you in this room and watching online are doing on new technologies in livestock. Again, as Juliet made in the bottom right paper and in the bottom left paper, there is potential for precision livestock technology, so wearable technologies, better use of AI cameras, lots of microphones, lots of different technologies that can help monitor livestock 24/7 in real time. Lots of potential benefits for better welfare. You could see how those technologies could be used to enhance welfare of individual animals. You could also see, if you think through, how the same technologies could be used in a way that potentially reduces welfare. And again, those conversations need to be had, and you need to foresee those potential downsides in order to have those conversations about, well, what could you put in place to lessen the risk of the poorer welfare happening. Then I wanted to talk a little bit more about this, the procedural and recognitional justice, which is when we think about the changes that we need to make in agri-food systems to make them more sustainable, how do we include those people that are key in implementing those changes and are affected by those changes? So this example and this talk is mainly going to be about farmers. That's what I do. I am mainly interested in change that happens on the farm. But obviously, there are changes that need to be made across agri-food systems, right from production through to packaging, distribution, consumption, and potentially, therefore, a whole range of different people you need to involve in thinking about what the changes should be and how to implement those changes. But I'm predominantly going to speak about the farming end of the spectrum. And I think before I do so, this point is worth making. So I'm not coming at this section from the position that inclusion is necessarily a good thing. I think that happens a lot. Stakeholder inclusion is presented as always good. If we've included some stakeholders, we've ticked a box, we've included 100 farmers, for example, then that makes the project better. Well, that may well be true, but depending on how you've done the inclusion and who you've included, you might have actually just almost legitimated exclusion. You might have looked like you've included people and made it more inclusive, but in involving perhaps the usual suspects, made it less inclusive. So inclusion isn't always good. It depends on the why, the who, and the how of inclusion. And again, this is a subject that has captured the attention of lots of social science groups all around the world. And there's lots of terrific scholars here and not on this slide that are doing work to try and understand who has the power to decide on what changes might be, who is being involved, if stakeholders are being substantively involved in setting changes or not, and how we might do inclusion better. I'm just going to showcase a couple of bits of work we've done on stakeholder inclusion in agri-food transitions and what that is looking like and how it might be improved. So there's some work that Wiki Daboon's done, so that's cut off at the bottom of this slide, but also some work that Ruth Little led when she was at Sheffield. She's now at DEFRA, and Judith Suvalis, who's now at Lancaster, led, looking at the co-design of the new environmental land management schemes in England. So very briefly, particularly for external people in the room or online, perhaps those from not from the UK, after Brexit, all of the devolved administrations, and it's a devolved issue, so England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland can decide upon their own agricultural policy. Agricultural policy had to be changed. We left the common agricultural policy. Everything needed to be started afresh. And England's approach, and this refers to England, came up with various environmental land management schemes as part of a wider set of policy instruments used in the agricultural transition. And DEFRA were very keen to say that they were going to co-design the new policy, that they were going to include stakeholders in setting what those policies said. And I really don't mean, this is badly done in 5 minutes, to imply that DEFRA have done that badly. There's 2 slides here with a lot of critical quotes about what some of the challenges have been. In fact, I think it's worth saying that setting out to co-design new agricultural policy was an incredibly ambitious and bold thing for DEFRA to do. Really, they set out to do something that government departments hadn't really done before. And setting out to include all stakeholders, all farming stakeholders, whether farmer, advisor, retailers, environmental groups, the list goes on, including all the groups, was a challenge that perhaps that DEFRA could never live up to. But they did try lots of different things, from online consultations, from workshops around the UK, to lots of a network of tests and trials, lots of different ways of trying to reach out and enabling different stakeholders from different who have different interests in trying to shape the policy for the future. But Wiki's work and Judith and Ruth's work looked at some of the challenges that were encountered when DEFRA civil servants tried to include different stakeholders. So Wiki's work, for example, found that, well, there was a perception that some groups were included more than others. And some of this criticism revolved around the stakeholder engagement group that DEFRA set up, that met more regularly with DEFRA than perhaps other groups, and there was a perception that DEFRA was speaking to some groups more than others. Secondly, there was this was actually probably the main source of criticism, that there was a perception that maybe the stakeholder views that had been gathered didn't have an impact, but perhaps more crucially, that the stakeholders who had inputted into the process didn't really know what effect that their views had had. That DEFRA, at least at the start, there's a lot more of this being done now. If you look at the work Janet Hughes does on social media, with blogs, etc., there's a much greater effort of feeding back, but at least initially, there was a perception the stakeholders who had fed in didn't quite know what had happened as a result of that process, and that, to some extent, disenfranchised some from wanting to be a part of the future. And then some of Ruth and Judith's work spoke to civil servants within DEFRA to ask about, well, what were some of the challenges in actually doing the co-design you said you were going to do? And there were lots here, from the constant turnover of staff and political uncertainty, the challenges of different teams in DEFRA working with one another, the fact that DEFRA and other government departments hadn't really done this co-design exercise before, and some of the perhaps the practical reasons, or at least some of the historic reasons, that DEFRA had a direct line to some stakeholder groups and found it easier to engage with some rather than others, meant that, to some extent, co-design was always going to be difficult to achieve if we define co-design as this academic ideal of including all stakeholders and giving equal power and letting them shape the future. Some other work we've done on stakeholder inclusion has been led by Kirsten Aris, who I'm co-supervising. She's still a PhD student at Reading. She has looked at how stakeholders are being included in the design of new innovations in the UK for agriculture, specifically agricultural robotics. So she became interested in this because she looked at a lot of the funding that DEFRA is giving out, including through Innovate UK, which should be governed by the principles of responsible innovation. So Innovate UK, like all of the research councils, signs up to responsible innovation. You can see it on the website. Substantive stakeholder inclusion is absolutely central to responsible innovation. So the funds that are being dished out for agricultural innovation, including the design of agricultural robotics, should, in theory, be including stakeholders in the work. So she set out to interview a whole range of people that were involved in developing agricultural robotics in the UK. And she asked them who they were including, how they were including, and why they were including. Because all of them said they were including stakeholders in some way. Now, mostly they said that they were including stakeholders to make the robots better designed for use in the conditions in which they were going to be used, which is important. But a relatively narrow sort of technology acceptance lens. How? Mainly through user trials, interviews, surveys, demonstration days, rather than perhaps some of the more deliberative stakeholder inclusion methods that we could use, like public dialogues or citizen juries, etc. And you can see from this diagram about who they said they included. So all of them, all of the roboticists said they included farmers and growers in the development and implementation of their innovation. And there were other groups that were more included than others. And some of the groups that weren't included, maybe they weren't included legitimately because it really didn't make sense to include farm animals for the robot that you were developing, or it didn't really make sense if you were dealing with a very narrow question for which it didn't really make sense to go wider. But if we think of agri-food transitions, because everybody eats, everybody consumes food, feasibly everybody could be a stakeholder in agri-food transitions. And I think it is often the case that we move very quickly to involve people in the food industry over other humans and also non-humans that are affected by different ways in which we do agriculture. So there's a few observations that you might make here. So firstly, the added complication that even within those groups, there is heterogeneity. So you might say you included farmers and growers, but we didn't really ask the question of, well, who do you mean? Is it the same 20 farmers that you've always engaged? Secondly, are there some questions related to agri-food transitions that we should include more widely on than others? So it seems to make sense that if you are wondering what is the best wheel for a robot to have to work in this environment, it doesn't seem really to make sense to me that you should send that out for wider public consultation and engagement and involve non-humans in that. That seems a relatively narrow question. But some of the bigger questions about what is the role of agriculture, robotics and AI in agriculture, what are some of the ethical challenges, seems to me that it's those sorts of questions where you could and should involve a wider set of both human and non-human stakeholders. And I think you see this being done quite well in some cases. So the Nuffield Council on Bioethics recently did a very nice public dialogue on gene editing in animals. The Food, Farming and Countryside Commission has done some work on a public dialogue looking at the future of the food system. And there are many other such examples where attempts are being made as far as possible to engage stakeholders, a wider set of stakeholders, in trying to determine what the changes should be. Okay, thirdly, and this is very much linked to what I've just said. So when we're thinking about making changes in agri-food systems, and particularly here I'm going to talk about changes that we are asking or telling farmers to make, we really need to be starting from the position that there are some farmers who will find it easier to change than others, for a huge variety of reasons, whether that is their perceived adaptive capacity, so their access to resources and their access to advisory networks and social support networks, or whether it's their attitude to risk, or whether it's the wider institutional environment that enables and incentivizes and can encourage change. There are some farmers who are much better able to adapt than others. And you can make it a normative position, but that those who are less able to adapt ought to be given greater and different support than those who are better able to adapt. And this is true, of course, of innovation. Now, this is work that some of the oldest work, this top right diagram is actually from the DEFRA-SIP project that Michael mentioned earlier. So this is work that we've done in the past on adoption of innovation. And there can be, or at least when I started working on this, the perception that if you design a technology that it works really well and is easy to use, you're winning. It'll be quickly adopted. Well, that's part of it. You do want innovations that are easy to use and perform well. But there's a whole host of other reasons why farmers do or don't or can and can't adopt technology or not, from whether they trust it, whether they can afford and invest in it, whether they have the right skills or access to the right infrastructure, etc. And we recently did some work, Sam Wayne from Harper was involved in this piece of work looking at skills needs for the future of technology use in agriculture, being involved in lots of work on digital extension and other technologies that show that for those farmers who are less able to adopt these new technologies because of skills or cost, etc., you need to think about the policy instruments you use to enable that adaptation. We often hear, well, when a robot's going to be ready, when a drone's going to be ready, when is this going to be ready and rolled out? And the answer always seems to me 5 years, no matter how long we've been having that conversation. But adoption of technology in agriculture is a process influenced by lots of things. You can have a technology that is ready, but that is not the point at which it becomes widely adopted. To have scaling, it can take an awful lot of time. So the emphasis that is often being placed on getting the technology ready and better, and then we'll solve all of our labour shortage, etc. problems, that's one thing. But thinking about the implementation is a lot more complex. Now moving on to the implementation. So there's the encouraging change. Whatever change you want to make, you want farmers or others to make, adoption of new practices, adoption of new technologies. How do you encourage and incentivise the change we are asking or telling food producers to make? So this is some of the work that we've done over the years on behavioural change, human behaviour change. So on the left-hand side, this is a relatively old report now. This is 2018, a report that myself, Carol Morris at Nottingham, did for the HDB, pulling the literature together on behavioural change in agriculture. And this pulled together a number of human behaviour change models that many of you might have heard of. Theory of plant behaviour, theory of reasoned action, the COM-B model, lots of different models that try and explain, predict, and help you encourage behavioural change. I've picked out, for the purposes of the next case study, this model, which is called the reset model. And this was first used, most used in an antibiotic, decreasing the use of antibiotics in the Netherlands for both farmers and veterinarians, but has been applied in lots of different cases now on farm. This suggests that if you have different interventions that cover 5 different areas, you can help farmers make changes. So the first is you have very clear rules to follow. So what are the rules of a project, or is it very clear what the farmer has signed up for and should implement? Education. So do farmers understand how to implement the new behaviour that you're asking them to implement? Thirdly, social norms. So can you get farmers to speak to other farmers and initiate the peer-to-peer learning that is important for demonstrating that that new behaviour is a normal thing to do and the right thing to do within your industry? Fourthly, economics, and I think this could be widened to other forms of incentive. So the new behaviour, how does it benefit the farmer economically or in some other way? And lastly, tools. So what different tools could be provided to help the farmer implement that new behaviour? And crucially, this model suggests that all of the things have to be in place at the same time for change to be encouraged. It's no good at farmer knowing how to do something if implementing it isn't beneficial. It's no good convincing a farmer that it's beneficial to do it if they don't know how to do it. All of these things have to work in combination, particularly if you have a short-term project that is designed to incentivise change, and then your funding runs out, and the incentives are removed, and you no longer provide economic incentives. How do you know the behaviour isn't going to revert back to normal if you haven't embedded perhaps some of the wider benefits or wider understanding of how and why they should do the behaviour? So we use this model in this project that Welsh Government funded in Wales, that the AHDB implemented. So it was an AHDB run project, but with funding from Welsh Government that came from the EU. So this worked over 3 years with 500 dairy farmers in Wales. And the aim of this project was to encourage farmers to do better preventative health planning in a number of specific areas, and those areas are mentioned there. So instead of dealing with problems as they arose, to try and have management actions in place to prevent those problems from occurring in the first place. And they used the reset model to develop interventions in all of these areas. So firstly, to be involved in the project and to benefit from the interventions, farmers had to follow some very clear rules. Education was provided in various ways. So AHDB extension officers were always on hand to help one-on-one farmers if they had any questions about what they should be implementing and how. Vet visits were paid for free. So vets, twice I think, went to the farm with the AHDB extension officer to collect data, to look at the problems that farm was facing, to identify priority action areas, and to identify priority actions to implement. That was provided for free. Economics, there were incentives like free testing for diseases and also the free vet visits. That means that farmers didn't have to pay for many of the actions that were implemented. The social norms, that was less done. There was an intention to set up farmer focus groups to share learnings from the project, but COVID kind of meant that those focus groups didn't meet as regularly as they would have done, and there were various tools provided to farmers. So if they were working on lameness, for example, the HDB would provide lameness scoring charts to help farmers. So all of these things worked at the same time to try and help farmers implement the new behaviours. And we asked, as surveys often ask, the farmers who were involved, well, what type of intervention helped you implement the agreed management actions. And you can see some things standing out. They quite like the free vet advice, they like the financial incentives of the free testing, etc. They liked that the HDB collected data to show how they were doing, for example, on Yonas at the start of the project and how they were doing on Yonas after they'd implemented the actions. But you can see some of these things were less identified as being important in the survey. So that acronym you can see, ACHEM, is the Extension Officer, Knowledge Exchange Manager. On its own, this doesn't really tell the full story because it implies that these interventions are mutually exclusive, and of course they're not. So that ACHEM that is down at the bottom made a lot of the things at the top happen. So without the Extension Officer, the tests might not have happened on time. The third parties who were doing that might not have done what they were supposed to do on time. The Extension Officer was always there at the meetings between the farmer and the vet to support and back up what the vet was saying and to help mediate the conversation, and was always on hand afterwards to help farmers implement what the vet has suggested. The data that showed how the farmer was doing on various actions wouldn't have been collected unless the Extension Officer collected it. So the success of this project, and it was very successful, was as much about the headline interventions, the free testing, as it was about the actual how the project worked together and how the Extension Officers, the HD project managers, meant that all the different people involved in the project, farmers, vets, third parties doing testing, etc., worked together. And this very much came out. So this is a quote from Michael Jordan. He's talking about how, well, of course he was the best player, but he wouldn't have scored all the points if his team hadn't got in the ball. This very much came out of the project. That if the Extension Officer hadn't have been there, doing all the role in helping the farmer after the vet visit, helping the vet turn up on time, mediate the conversation, would the value of the vet advice and the free testing have been as big as if the Extension Officer hadn't have been there? And that was an important message very much for after the project. If you have a more limited budget and you say you can only support free vet visits, for example, and nothing else, would actually that the value of those vet visits have been as valuable without the support of other people involved in the extension system? So lastly, just in my last 5 minutes now, I hope I'm okay on time, I want to talk about coping with change. Encouraging change is one thing, but helping farmers cope with what can be very stressful periods of change is another. We know that change on farm is always stressful. Every day on farm is stressful in some way because there's a potential for something to go wrong. Alongside all of the things that farmers have to deal with, bad weather, animal, crop disease, etc., that is exacerbated now at a period of greater policy change. So whether it's with ELMS, whether it's net zero targets, etc., farmers are having to navigate very sometimes complicated changes in policy and implement and learn about new ways of farming at a time when all the other challenges in agriculture remain. And helping farmers cope with this change, as well as implement the changes, is very important. And it's work that increasingly is being done around the world to look at the mental well-being of farmers and how you help them cope with change, both in lots of different countries, some work that Procedural has done, and across the world. And it's something that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. So at this point of the talk, I was going to say, for the people in the room and the people online, could donate to this cause, which I'm going to say in a minute, to the value of what you think this talk is worth at this point. But I didn't think that would help Tom to do that comic relief style, pay what you think this talk was worth. But Tom York, and there's lots of students and alumni and staff who do great things here for wellbeing. Now, Tom is doing an ultimate triathlon, which seems to be swimming, running and cycling a long way. Don't know how long, but it's a long, long way. And he's raising money for FCN. So if anyone online wants to follow the QR code, you can donate what you think that's worth. Not what this talk's worth, what you think that great achievement is worth. But as we know, farming mental well-being is influenced by lots of different things. And the work we've done on this, either with young farmers in Ireland and the UK, or with all groups of farmers in the UK, shows that mental well-being and stress and anxiety and depression isn't caused just by one thing. It's a combination of all sorts of different factors from the social, online criticism, policy, business factors, crisis events that combine to create a very stressful environment for some farmers to cope with. And if you have poor mental well-being, it is much harder to think how you adapt your business and have the capacity to make those changes than it is if you were in better mental health. And we've done work on trying to identify what those challenges might be, and also how to better support all those different people and organisations who support farmers. And there are lots of different groups that support farmers, from state-funded primary healthcare, which isn't as accessible or available as should be, the fantastic mental health charities we have in agriculture. We have FCN here, there are many others, agricultural chaplains, staff at auction marts, people in the community, peer groups, all sorts of different people who support farmers through difficult times and themselves face challenges of funding, of staff trauma, dealing with very difficult situations, the challenges of various rural digital divides, etc. And that's something we're particularly interested in. And lastly, and this is something that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, I think Laura and Graham are here who have been involved with some of this work. I went out to Cornell for 3 months at the end of the year, and partially that was to work with New York FarmNet, who are an organisation funded by New York State and markets and other forms of other strands of government to support farmers in difficult times. And they've been working in New York State since 1986. The first year of that support, they only offered financial consultancy. So a struggling farming business could phone in, and a financial consultant could be sent to help that farmer develop their business. After that year, financial consultants came back and said, sometimes we can't do our job. We are encountering situations that we are not trained for, that we can't discuss the finances and the change of the business because there is relationship conflict, there are succession problems, there are a wide variety of social challenges for which we are not trained to deal with. And now, when a struggling farmer reaches out for support, New York FarmNet offers a combined support service where both a financial consultant and a social family counsellor go together to support that farmer and that family to develop their business. They start from where the farmer is, they identify what the challenges are in helping the business to adapt, and they work together to provide the business but the social support to enable that change. And that's something we with a group on the bottom left, we hope to try and pilot in a new project to try and implement that model in the UK, because very often, and we see this with the Farm Resilience Fund, with the agricultural transition in England, there's lots of support often for financial and business consultancy for farmers, but less support and less integration of the social support within that business advice. So I'll leave the conclusions up. Alex wants me to take questions now, but I hope I've got across the yes, transitions are disruptive, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. That we have to ensure transitions are fair and think about the costs and the benefits and how we include. Some people need more help to change than others. That change needs incentivising for the long term, and ideally to include the social support that underpins a farmer and other food producers' ability to be able to adapt. Thanks for listening. I hope I've not gone over too long.
So, does anybody have any questions from the room? Oh wow, David, you've answered everything. Anybody?
Stunned silence.
Oh, Simone has one.
Hi David, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. It was really good to view it from all those different perspectives. As this is your first lecture at Harper in your new role, I just wonder, there's a perfect opportunity for a call to action to us as a community. So within this nexus, how do you see higher education providing a contribution to support the change and the challenges that you've spoken about, aside from the obvious ones around research, innovation, changes in technology, in terms of what you're talking about here, really?
Yes. So you remember the diagram I showed with the wheel of different groups of stakeholders that you ought to include in agri-food transitions? I put that up at Penn State University. And their agricultural educators there said you should have educators on that diagram, and I think I would agree. So I think firstly it's about thinking what the curriculum looks like, and are we actually teaching the skills and that actually farmers or advisors and others of the future will need. So I'm sure that's being done, but it's adapting that curriculum, and that came out of that robotics report that we did with the UK RAS network. Are we actually, farmers of the future, advisors of the future, food producers, retailers of the future, whoever, need the core skills that perhaps we've always taught, but they need other skills as well. More emphasis on the environment and sustainability, more emphasis on perhaps some of the social support, the communication, the extension support. So I think it's teaching the right things so that ultimately our students go out into the world with a wider range of skills. Ideally, some of those skills to be able to offer integrated advice. So when they encounter a farmer, for example, that is struggling with change, to be able to signpost them towards social support as well as knowing about the agronomy, for example. I think that's the key thing.
David, I'm Bob Bansback, an agricultural economist. Thank you ever so much for a very broad-ranging lecture. What strikes me is the vast range of academic disciplines that are involved in a lot of these works, and these teams must have included a lot of skills. I mean, firstly, how difficult is that sort of research to do? Can you tell us how you set about this? Because I can imagine that's... And to what extent is this sort of work being carried out in other parts of Europe and in the US? I mean, are we learning, in other words, lessons from what they're up to?
Yes, that's a good question. So I've gone back to this slide because these are the people that have been in our group since 2019. And I won't go through all of them, but there's geographers, animal welfare scientists, environmental scientists, historians, an English literature student. Who else have we got? Lots of different groups. Economists, 2 economists in there. I've never cared what discipline someone comes from. I've never looked at any of these people and thought you are that or that. It doesn't really matter, and it shouldn't really matter. Only to say that their disciplines and their insights and the literatures they're grounded in are important, and to respect everybody's point of view. It's been challenging as a leader, and I think we often find this, all of us in interdisciplinary projects, it can be a challenge to work with other disciplines that you don't have a great understanding of. And although working in this way means I have tried to understand where they come from, it's not really about that, but it's about respecting the value of their knowledge and where it comes from. That's absolutely central to it. So you can be part of the group, and I don't care what discipline you come from. And I think if there was more of that, I think that would be great. And I know we very much here at Harper and elsewhere, we're moving towards more interdisciplinary working. And people often say, oh, is it hard? Is it a challenge? I don't think it has to be at all, really, if that you take the effort to fully respect different knowledge types. And the second part of that question, is it being done elsewhere? So a lot of the work I've described on behavioural change, of looking at the justice of transitions, it's being done in lots of different places. I feel really bad because there are colleagues from all of the continents that are doing this work and whose work I could have profiled and I haven't. But I think it is being done. Whether it always has, particularly some of the social science work, whether it always has as much uptake as perhaps some of the sexier, less designer robot work is another question and a debate we can have later. But it certainly is being done, and hopefully it'll cut through a bit more, because I think the biggest challenges we face with agri-food transitions are the implementation rather than the solutions, the technology, which are important, but the implementation is where it's at, I think.
So, David, I agree that was fantastic. Thank you very much. And it reassures all the colleagues that we've got the correct academic to come in and work with us, because the work that you... Okay. Hello? That's loud. The work that you've summarised, cuts across everything we do at Harper, in terms of applied agriculture, engineering, land and property management, animal science, and a clear implementation is critical. And the report that the School of Sustainable Food and Farming delivered, which James Logber led, showed that a big challenge that we have is that extension service. So how are we going to drive Harper as a key delivery for that extension? So what are your ways that your science and your interaction with colleagues here and supporting with the School of Sustainable Food and Farming is going to deliver that? Because one of the key recommendations from that report was the role of institutes like Harper to deliver that extension.
Yes.
Thanks, David.
Yeah. So the first part, that one of the reasons why I came to Harper was the breadth of research that's done. So I look out into the audience, animal science, rural resilience, all the different groups. That's really exciting to be able to work together, because the solutions we need to implement need all of the different sources of expertise to be able to enable that. But our role in the extension system. So I've worked, and I know the Centre for Effective Innovation in Agriculture that Harper's part of, that Kate Preston manages from the RE, who's done a lot of thinking about the AKIS, for want of a better word, the Agriculture Knowledge and Innovation System. And it's no secret that England and the UK, England particularly, compared to perhaps Scotland, for example, extension system is a fragmented mess. And I think I can say that without offending people involved. There are lots of extension groups, publicly funded, private groups, who do wonderful extension work. And we could list the organisations in that AKIS from research and industry and others. But it's fragmented in a way that perhaps in Ireland, for example, and in other parts of the world, it is not fragmented. And that means that you have lots of different groups of actors, some competing for the same money often, perhaps doing duplication of effort, some more accessible to farmers than others because a lot of it isn't freely available. And I think, I always thought for a research institution, and I think this is something the Universities Council and some of the work that the Centre is doing, is to try and think how you can better coordinate and join up that landscape. And I think whatever Harper does, whether it's the Sustainable Farms Network, whatever, it has to think, how do you collaborate with others? Nothing can be done, and I know nothing is now done, but nothing can be done on its own. I think it's a competitive funding landscape, but you have to move away from we're the best at this and we lead that, to actually letting go to some extent of some of the work we do and being able to collaborate and give equal power to those groups that can do the stakeholder engagement that perhaps we can't. Harper can do a lot of the stakeholder engagement, but we can't access all of the groups and the expertise that we need to pull in order to deliver change. So I think it's just that collaborative working, that's what Harper does and will do. I'm glad you said something positive, because you could, UK labour law, you can get rid of me within 2 years, so I'm glad you said it was okay.
You're still going to probation?
Yes, I'm still in probation. There we go.
I've got a question here, David. Thanks very much for your presentation, and welcome to Harper as well. On the socio-technical paradigm that we live, you did mention that perhaps we should not look into the net zero journey. So I wonder how you could explain it a little bit.
Yes. Well, if I said we shouldn't look into the net zero journey, I misspoke. I'm not quite sure I said that, but I'll try and explain what I think I meant by the comment you referred to. If I've misinterpreted the question, please tell me I've misinterpreted the question. But I think earlier on, I might have spoken about some of the protests around the goal of net zero. Is that what you were referring to? Yes. And that comment, and it was probably poorly explained, but that comment came out as a result of something we see with the European protests. So after the European farmer protests, we see the European Union diluting some of the green pledges within European policy. And that really is something I'm stressing that we shouldn't allow, or that shouldn't happen. Because diluting some of the net zero, the biodiversity targets, etc., it really digs farmers' own graves, really. If agriculture doesn't become more sustainable, we don't look after the soil, we don't look after biodiversity, we don't look after the climate, then it's going to make life a lot harder for farmers. So I was trying to argue that in legitimately protesting around some of the things I think farmers are legitimately angry about, whether or not they've been included, whether or not they've been unfairly blamed for some of the environmental crises that they are being blamed for, and I would agree that farmers are often blamed more than perhaps other industries, But that doesn't mean to say that agriculture doesn't contribute to environmental crises. That I'm arguing that the conversations and the changes should be about the how we implement the transitions rather than what transitions we're making. And if the conversation becomes we shouldn't make the net zero transition, we've got a real problem. That's what I was trying to argue.
David, we have a couple of questions from people online. Conscious that we're just slowly running a little over time, but for those that want to stay with us online, they can, of course. So the first question is, are the new ELM payments a big enough incentive to drive change?
Well, I mean, we don't have a crystal ball, of course, so we can't quite see what's going to happen, which is, it's a relatively newly implemented policy, which has had challenges. We've seen very recently that changes have had to be made because there was a concern that too much land is being taken out of production, so there were changes with rules around those payments. So I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know. I don't know what the level of engagement is going to be or what the outputs are going to be. But I know that as part of that co-design, as they are doing now, DEFRA has agreed to make it to some extent an iterative process, that they are available to make tweaks and make changes if, for example, it isn't doing something that the DEFRA intended.
Thanks, David. Another one from somebody who's joined us online. I wanted to ask about the AHDB research that found farm advisors to be, quote, the glue for all the interventions. Could you expand on how we might determine what the key glue is for interventions in behavioural change?
Yes. So, I mean, I highlighted the Herd of Man's project because I really do think, and the evidence suggested it really was a successfully implemented project, largely because all bits of the project worked very well together. And kudos particularly to Delith and Tegan and the AHDB project managers who ran that project, because they put just as much effort into how people communicate and how it worked together than they did with the actual delivery of what the interventions were. Now, in that case, that just happened to be a case where the extension officer was crucial, because they were the sort of all-rounder that connected people in the project together and helped make some of the very practical things happen. I think there were lots of other examples of different projects where different people might be the glue to some extent. But I unfairly perhaps highlighted the role of the extension officer. Really, I meant to say everybody was important in that project, and it was important that everybody communicated and worked well together. And I think that's so important for any of us academics that are trying to encourage farmers to implement something, is to think about who the implementation partners are, researcher, farmer, and everybody in between, to make sure that we work together to implement the changes that we want ultimately to be implemented. And identifying those key knowledge brokers, I think, is always absolutely vital.
Thank you, David. And another one online here, before we wrap things up. You've identified a project where on-farm advice was critical. English agriculture lost its public extension service over 4. Thank you. Sorry, David. Other countries, including devolved nations, have retained the service. Is it possible to quantify the effect of these different approaches?
I'm sure it's possible. There's plenty of people that have tried to do it. The Centre for Effective Innovation in Agriculture is very interested in trying to determine the value of different ACCISs and how they work. I'm not the sort of person that will quantify anything as a qualitative social scientist, but I'm sure it can be done. But to reiterate the point I made earlier, that is a huge challenge. I think almost every single project the DEFRA commission, one of the conclusions of any project is always knowledge exchange is key, farm advisors are key, but the extension service is fragmented. But the extension service isn't, at least for the time being, going to go back to a publicly extension model. That's not happening, because the perception has been for a while now that public money shouldn't be used for services that can be provided by the private sector. And the private sector is providing the services. Whether the services are accessible to everyone is a different question, but we're not going to go back. I've asked DEF a lot of times. That's not on the table. It should be on the table. And it would be a lot easier. It would have been a lot easier for elms to be co-designed, and a lot easier for many of these new policies to be implemented if there was an extension system that was freely available and publicly funded, but that's not happening. So if that isn't happening, it's always a challenge of how best you can work in that setting. And it is the collaborative working answer that I gave to Michael, but it's far from ideal.
Without doubt, a challenge, I think, there, David. And this really must be the last question. We'll have to draw things to a close. So thank you to everyone that submitted a question online that we haven't had the opportunity to answer. So this question comes from Jude Kappa. She says, superb talk. I sometimes wonder whether we, academia, are always going to be less effective than peer-to-peer learning, farmers talking to other farmers, at effecting behavioural change. Is there a way to harness this so that the research we carry out at HAU can translate better into on-farm practice?
Yes. Well, thank you, Joe. I hope my arm waving was good enough for you. You said you arm waved too much in a recent talk, and I said there could never be too much arm waving in a talk, so I hope that was okay for you, Jude. But I'd agree with very much the premise of the question. And I wrote this in the Farmers Weekly column. Why should any farmer listen to me? I've never farmed anything. I've not done a day's farming in my life. And it's not true for everybody. There's many Harper researchers and many people in academia who have some experience of farming, but many don't. So I understand absolutely the premise of that question. How can we really understand the challenges farmers face if we aren't farmers? I'm looking at Fiona and others in the room who are farmers who occupy both worlds. But the peer-to-peer learning, absolutely. And I mean, there's lots of examples of projects, and you could pick out the Sustainable Farm Network that Harper is now involved with, of where you can build peer-to-peer learning into the project from the start. And not as just a sort of knowledge transfer at the end. This is what the academics have done in the project, this is what we found, let's tell you about it. That never works. That knowledge transfer model is not. We tried the public deficit of understanding model for a long time with our science communication, not very effective. Including the farmers, peer-to-peer learning from the very start of the project to try and influence what you research, how you research it, how you undertake the research methods, how you involve people in doing farm trials, etc. And then equip farmers to go out and be champions of the research through demonstration farms, networks, etc. All of those things have to always be on the table, I think, in every project. We never should be informing farmers, I don't think, about how to do anything. We should be having that two-way conversation about the challenges they face, the relevant solutions that will best impact their farm, and to make sure it's that two-way process all the way through.
David, thank you. Really fantastic talk. I think I speak for everyone when I say we really enjoyed that this morning. Welcome to Harper Adams. Again, I think I speak for everyone when we say we're delighted to have you. It's been a really useful, insightful, interesting session, and I'd like to invite the audience to just give you a short round of applause.